Good morning, everyone, and happy Tuesday. Today we will be reading Chapter 2 of Because of Winn, Dixie. So go ahead and get out your books and turn to page 13, and we will go ahead and get started. So Chapter 2 of Because of Winn, Dixie. That summer, I found Winn, Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn Dixie. You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk. Bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all of my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had paper spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he is thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn Dixie! Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap. right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. "What did you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn-Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I've ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. "And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure." "Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked, real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," the preacher said, "I guess you found one." Alright, and that is the end of chapter 2 for Winn-Dixie. What we are going to do now is go over the vocabulary, so go ahead and get out your packets that look like this, and go ahead and flip to the vocabulary page, and we're going to work on 2 words today. We're going to do one together, and then I want you to define the second word by yourself. So the word that we are going to define together is the word exception. Now, exception can be found on page 15 in our books, so let's go ahead and turn back to page 15 in chapter 2 and see if we can use context clues to figure out what the definition of exception means. So on page 15, we'll just go ahead and start at the beginning of the page, so at the very top, I'll go ahead and read, and when we get to the word exception, we'll stop and see what our context clues tell us. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet, because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher, and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception, and I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Alright, so the word exception. So think of what it said again. It said that Opal was the only kid in the Friendly Corners trailer park because Mr. Alfred called her an exception. So think about, sometimes people might say if there are rules, there might be an exception to the rule. So think about what your context clues might help with. Maybe you have background knowledge that could help you define this word. So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about what you think that word means, and then we'll go over it together. Okay, so the word exception means a person or thing that is excluded from a general statement or rule. So for example, the rule at the trailer park was that no kids could live there. It was adults only. But Opal was an exception to the rule. So she was a statement or a person or place that didn't have to follow that rule. So she was able to live there because she was a good kid and she was a preacher's kid. And then Winn-Dixie would also be an exception to the rule because since there are no kids, she probably wasn't allowed to have her own dog. So he would also be an exception, which means he wouldn't have to follow that rule. So that is what exception means. If you would like to pause the video so you can write this down, you're going to write it right next to exception for number 4. If you want, you can go ahead and pause the video. I'll hold this up for a few more seconds. That way you can pause the video and see what it says. Okay. Now your second word is stray, and you can find stray on page 18. So if you go to page 18, in the last paragraph is where the preacher uses the term stray. So it says, "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I've ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. So he called Winn-Dixie the dog a stray. So think about background knowledge. What does it mean if there's a stray dog? So think about it, maybe use a dictionary. And then on your own, you're going to write that definition next to number 3. So number 3 and number 4, the 2 vocab words that I want you to define today. In chapter 2, we've also learned a little bit more about Opal and her character. So what we are going to do now is go to the last page of your packet, and you'll see underneath it, it says characters, and it'll look like this. Let me fold it so you can see it. It'll look like this. Alright, we are going to figure out some character traits of Opal. So she's the first person on our list, and you'll also see that we have the preacher and Winn-Dixie. Alright, we'll get to them later, but today we're just going to focus on Opal. And this is going to be for a grade, so it'll also be due by Friday, alright? And we're also going to be doing Winn-Dixie later this week as well. So you'll have both of these for a grade this week. But today we're just going to focus on Opal. So with Opal, we can use chapters 1 and 2 to think of different character qualities of Opal. And what I would like you to do is try to find at least one and have textual evidence that goes with it. So for example, in chapter 2, on page 16, Opal is trying to get her dad to allow her to keep Winn-Dixie. So she says, "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" And he says, "Mm-hmm." And she goes, "Well, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." Reading this page tells me that I think one of the character qualities of Opal is kindness or caring, because she's wanting to help someone, Winn-Dixie, who's less fortunate than her, and wants him to live with her so she can help take care of him. Alright, in chapter 1 it also talks about how she notices how skinny he is and how messy his fur is and how he stinks, and she wants to help take care of him. So that would be another good textual evidence that you could use with this character trait. There's a couple of other character traits that you could use with her. Maybe curious, because she does ask Winn-Dixie a lot of questions and wants to know things. There's also kind, because she does take care of Winn-Dixie and is kind to him. So there's quite a few different character traits that you could come up with Opal on your own, but that is an example of caring or being kind, and then try to use textual evidence to support that character trait. So what you're going to do, in a complete sentence, you're going to write next to Opal, "I think Opal is kind because on page 16 she did this." Alright, so make sure you have a complete sentence and you have textual evidence to support that character trait. Alright? If you guys have any questions, just let me know at the bottom of this video, and you guys enjoy the rest of your day.